Hello students, hopefully this video finds you well, whether that be from the comfort of your own home or from the comfort of the schoolroom. Now for today, we're gonna go ahead and get into the education, health, and famine. So these three major issues in Africa. Remember, Africa being the continent that we're focusing on for this unit in Unit 7 here in Social Studies, 6th grade. So our learning objectives for today is Today I Will learn about the issues of education, health, and famine in Africa, so I can understand how government instability impacts the standard of living in Africa. And then I know I have it when I'm able to successfully create a graffiti wall that calls for reform in unstable African governments. And the graffiti wall is just gonna be like a little art activity we're doing after the lesson. So getting into just kind of the overview. So Africa, the standard of living as in basically how comfortable people are able to live, as in do they have enough or adequate shelter? Do they have enough food to eat? Are they getting a decent income with their jobs? That's a standard of living, and for Africa, it's actually quite low. So many Africans cannot actually meet their basic needs, and poverty or poorness is widespread. 3/4, so 75% of the world's poorest countries are going to be located in Africa. Now, there are a lot of issues across Africa that actually affect or impact the quality of life for all its people, such as unstable governments. It's kind of like the big one. Access to education, lack of healthcare, and also the threat of famine. Famine just being basically a lack of food, not having enough food to go around to eat. Here you can see the poor quality of life or the low standard of living that tends to be in a lot of parts of Africa. Not every part of Africa, but a decent amount of Africa. A good majority of it is not the greatest standard of living. Okay. So instability. Okay, this is going to be kind of like the big overarching problem here that causes a lot of those issues with health, famine, and also the poor education systems in Africa is going to be government instability. Instability, kind of a big fancy word that just means things that are not stable. Okay, so government instability is a major issue that has kept African nations from improving their citizens' standard of living. So a lot of parts of Africa, there's civil wars, military coups, and revolutions that cause power to change hands many times. Okay, so if you're unfamiliar, so a civil war, military coup, or revolutions, what they all tend to have in common is it's pretty much people trying to overcome another in terms of like government versus like rebels that want to overthrow the government. There's a lot of countries in Africa that do this, and so it's always a constant war basically between certain African governments versus rebel groups, and it's a constant flip-flop, okay? And it's really hard to get things done whenever there's this constant fighting and war going on here. So when a country's government is unstable like this, it really can't meet the needs of the people. Okay, it's really hard to get people educated, give them adequate food and shelter whenever people are too busy trying to fight for who's going to be in power of that country. So these political conflicts keep many of those African countries from providing education opportunities and finding a solution to the issues of famine, of poverty, and of disease. And here's just kind of like a little visual example of a possible military group or militant group that would be causing issues here in Africa. Now moving on to education. So access to education, as in people actually being able to have an education in Africa, is actually a huge issue that many African countries face. Many of these nations have been involved in civil wars and have had very little time or money to invest in an education system. Okay, again, very hard to educate people, to teach them things whenever the countries are basically busy fighting amongst each other or between countries. And as a result, access to education in Africa is often limited. Okay, it's almost a privilege of sorts, right? So if you're able to actually send your citizens to actually have students to attend school, then that probably means that that African country actually has the privilege to, be able to do those things and not always constantly fighting. So just kind of taking a look at here at this picture. So when you see it, it's like, whoa, they're, outside, they're, not just being cramped up in a school building all day. But even despite that, let's maybe take just a minute to kind of pause and discuss, their teacher with the students in the room or virtual learners at home, just kind of think over this. What do you think might be some issues here if, classes are really just held outside rather than just inside? Okay, so let's take a moment to just talk about that. And also, I want you all to keep this image here in your head because in a couple of slides, we're going to compare it with another image. Depending on education, children who live in Africa's cities have greater access to education. So urban areas, people that live there, They tend to have more school like houses, so more schools, more access to a better job so they get paid better, so people that can actually afford to send their students to school. Whereas in rural areas or like country areas, where there's a lot of farming or farmers, there is not as much money. There's a shortage of money, teachers, and also school buildings. Okay, as we can probably see here in this image before, probably a rural area. And families who are too poor to send all of their children to school, a lot of times actually have to do work or do chores. Okay, so instead of being able to afford to send students to school, then they're basically put straight into the workforce, or they're just helping around the house and they can't really attend school because they can't really afford to go to school. Okay, so this is an example of I want to say it's a urban school in Africa, so it has some better accommodations here. So just really think about the comparisons and the contrast, so what's similar and also what's different from the picture that we saw a couple slides ago. Okay, so what are the differences between this picture, and what do you think the differences are between this picture, and why do you think that is? Most likely a rural school versus an urban school. So a school in Africa that's probably out in the country versus an African schoolroom here in an African city. All right, so quite a bit of things there in terms of differences. Now, as far as disease goes, governments of many African nations have actually failed, okay, to focus on building proper healthcare systems for the citizens. So there's not really a whole lot of hospitals to house people. So too few hospitals, not enough doctors to go around, also not enough qualified doctors. So yeah, some of these poor African countries might have a decent amount of doctors, but maybe those doctors don't really have the necessary training to make them very good doctors, as well as insufficient supplies to treat outbreaks of major diseases, all right? And so here's gonna be an example of one of the poorer countries in Africa. I don't know the exact country that this is, but you can see here that this is not quite the kind of environment you probably want to have if you're trying to treat a patient, so that way they can get better. There's a decent amount of beds, but there's just way too many patients to the point where these patients actually have to stay on the floor rather than a bed. And also it seems like there's not really enough hospital personnel, so not enough nurses or doctors to actually go about and help the patients here. Okay, so not enough hospitals tends to lead to overcrowding in the hospitals, and there's just not enough doctors and nurses to go around here. So huge issue. And again, a lot of that has to be from government instability. Now, epidemic. So in many instances, African governments have not been effective, as in they're not very good at distributing medicines in emergencies. Okay, so kind of think about, so epidemic is kind of like an outbreak of a disease, so kind of similar to like the coronavirus that, is still kind of a thing now. But an epidemic is actually going to be smaller, more kind of localized in like a little, just like a little society area. Whereas a pandemic, which is what we're experiencing now, is pretty much more widespread in terms of like across an entire continent or country, or even the world. Okay, so the coronavirus is a pandemic. It's not an epidemic. Epidemic is kind of a smaller one. But either way, a lot of African governments actually are not very effective in giving out medicines or giving out vaccines to people during this outbreak of disease. So a lot of times this can turn into again, deadly epidemics where African governments just really aren't able to act quickly. And some of these epidemics that have occurred in Africa include malaria, Ebola, and even AIDS or HIV. And again, we can owe that to a lot of the instability. So a lot of the civil wars going on, a lot of the conflicts that tend to happen amongst these poor African countries, the government just isn't able to provide for the people when they're too busy fighting or trying to, funnel money into getting a better military. And here's just kind of an image, a visualization of a bunch of graves of the victims that most likely died due to these epidemic outbreaks in Africa. Famine, okay, and again, famine. One of Africa's biggest problems, and famine is basically like a food, okay? Whenever a region does not have enough food for a long period of time, that's gonna be what a famine is, right? Just not having enough food to go around for people to eat. And in a lot of these African countries here, famine has taken a stronghold when governments have failed to provide enough of these resources to feed the people. Okay, so again, going back to the government instability, not having a stable government, the government is constantly flip-flopping sides. Oh, the rebels own the country now. Oh, no, now the government owns the country now, and it's just this constant fighting back and forth. things aren't able to get done. People aren't able to get fed. They're not able to get vaccinations or treated for diseases, and they're not able to receive the education that is required for them whenever their unstable governments are too busy trying to vie for power. And this is actually going to be a map of all the widespread famine here in Africa. And as you can see here at the bottom, 200 million Africans suffer from chronic hunger throughout the continent. Now, just looking at the map here, so the color, kind of like a tannish yellowish, means chronic malnutrition, as in there's a decent amount of not enough food going around here in a lot of these areas around South, Central, and little parts of the northern part of Africa. And then it kind of just gets worse here as we go down. So food shortages, as in there's not enough food for people to actually go around here, is going to be indicated by the lines going diagonally. And you'll see here some of the worst areas tend to be in the red, where it's the main areas of famines during the last 30 years. Okay, so this is just the areas where there's just been so much, or really not a lot of food going around for a very, very long time. All right. And the stars are just some conflicts that happened or occurred in the 90s. But now looking at this map, let's think for a second. So these really hard hit areas with the red lines going diagonally, these main areas of famine, okay? What do y'all think? So we're gonna take a moment to pause the video and discuss this with class, or virtual learners, just kind of think on this yourself for a little bit. What do y'all think the government structures are like in these red areas here? Okay, so just take a moment to pause that and discuss. And just kind of think about that. If you came to the conclusion that they're probably not very structured government systems, like thinking like the anarchy in Somalia, then you're probably right. Okay, so lack of food. So kind of going back into the whole famine thing, a lot of African countries face drought because of climate changes. Okay, drought just being when we're talking about weather, you're just not getting enough rain. So this constant drought has plagued Africa since the 70s. Okay, even nowadays, there's still some drought issues going on in Africa. And soil barrenness and erosion have decreased the amount of crops that are able to be grown here. Okay, so you don't have a whole lot of rainwater. Your soil is not going to be able to, retain its, well, one, its moisture and also its nutrients as well without all that rain. And then diseases actually reduce the workforce available to farm the land. So even if your soil here in Africa is able to get a decent amount of nutrition, get a decent amount of moisture, if there's a whole bunch of diseases going around, people are not getting treated because of the unstable governments, the people that actually are able to work the land, so like farmers, farm workers, people aren't able to actually get the crops, okay, because not everyone is able to have the skills necessary to grow food or grow crops. And then as you can see here in the image, over 8,500 or 8,500 African children under the age of 5 died from hunger in the year 2013. Just 2013 alone, 8,500 African children around the or under the age of 5 died because they just were not able to eat. Okay, again, mostly in part due to instability in their government. Okay, so the stability of a country's government directly impacts the country's ability, the means for them to actually provide enough food, to prevent famine, to prevent people from going hungry and dying. So civil wars, constant infighting, interrupts this daily life for most people, including farmers, which causes food shortages. And some of these African governments have actually built armies instead of actually investing in food for their people. Okay, so instead of just trying to make sure that everyone in your country is fed and not dying of hunger, instead they're actually just trying to make sure that their governments are able to, fight off the rebels. Okay, so they're funneling all their money, all their, what little money that the country probably has into making a military force rather than actually, trying to send people to school, paying for schools, paying for hospitals and healthcare, or even making sure that people are getting fed. And then other governments have also used food as a weapon by denying food shipments to political enemies. So it's kind of like, oh, hey, we're not going to be able to, give you food here because we want to go ahead and, have control over you by preventing us from giving you the food that you probably need to help your starving people in your country here in Africa. Okay, so pretty much all the big topics here we talked about with famine, the lack of healthcare in Africa, and as well as the lack of access to education, a lot of that really does tend to stem from this unstable or the government instability in a lot of Africa. Okay, again, not all of Africa is like this, but a really alarming amount is. Okay, so now we're gonna go ahead and move on to the next video in today's folder, which is going to show you all the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is a country located in like central southern Africa. And there's going to be students here in this country that are taking their first high school final exam after years of civil war. So a lot of infighting and political unrest. All right. And, you know, just kind of ruminate on the video. And then afterwards, you're going to go ahead and watch the third video, which is going to discuss what we're doing for our activity for today. All right, let's get to that.